Hello everyone, welcome to yet another session of the daily news analysis by SRIRAM'S IAS, where we take up the important articles featuring in the Hindu newspaper and break them down for our understanding from the examination point of view. So let's start today's discussion by taking up the important articles from the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper. So the first article which appears on the newspaper reads, "What is the Criminal Procedure Identification Act 2022? Now, the Union government has promulgated a new act in the parliament, a new bill, which is known as the Criminal Procedure Identification Act. This is brought out to replace a 1920 act for this same provision, which was known as the Identification of Prisoners Act 1920. So this act has been brought out to replace this act. So in this article, we will try to understand what this act is all about, what are the various provisions of this act, how is it different from this 1920 act, and what are some of the concerns which the criticizers of the act are raising. So this becomes important for us from the point of view of GS2, right? So what is the Criminal Procedure Identification Act? Now the genesis of this act comes from the importance of knowing the measurements or the features of the culprits or the accused who are taken up in, through arrest. So we all see in various movies and fiction shows that based on these measurements and the features of the pre-existing culprits or the database that contains these features is becoming very important and proves out to be very useful for the law enforcement agencies to carry out their investigation and to nab the real culprit. So within that framework itself, this act has now been brought out to enlarge the database of measurements taken, where earlier if only fingerprints were taken, now apart from the measurements, height, fingerprints, certain other aspects of the with the advent of technology and the various new features that have come up, the retina scan or the palm imprints, now additional features will also be taken up under the Criminal Procedure Identification Act, and these features will then be used to identify the accused. So let's first try to understand what is the use of identification details in criminal trials. So measurements are those words, is the singular word used to describe all the features that are recorded of the person arrested, and photographs for identification of three main purposes. So it is done for mainly three purposes. First is to establish the identity of the culprit against the person being arrested. So finding out the culprit is the first purpose, obvious purpose. Then to identify suspected repetition of similar offences by the same person. So so if the person is a history sheeter in terms that he or she has committed a crime multiple number of times, and after first commission the features get registered in the database, that can be identified as the repeat offender. So that becomes another purpose. And third is to establish a previous conviction, whether that person was previously convicted or not. So these are the basic reasons as to why such kind of act is necessary. So what was there in the 1920 act, and how is the Criminal Procedure Identification Act of 2022 different? So let's take a look at the differences between the two. So first, Identification of Prisoners Act, it was brought out in the year 1920, and this one is almost 100 years after, more than 100 years after that is the Criminal Procedure Act has been, Identification Act has been brought out. And the simple reason for is that the procedures of criminal investigation have definitely modernized, have improved, and such improvements and modernized features need to be enacted in the newer laws as well. So that has been the parent genesis as to why the law is being amended. Then what are the differences? So with respect to the persons whose measurement can be taken, earlier the 1920 law said that the person should be convicted of an offence punishable with rigorous imprisonment of 1 year of upwards, which means that that person who has committed a crime, the crime of which has a punishment of 1 year and upwards. So let's say the person has committed a theft and the punishment for theft is 3 years or 5 years. So this is more than 1 year. In that case, the person's feature or measurements can be recorded, right? So it gave a certain threshold for the crime. The crime should be at least more than 1 year punishable. But this 2022 law says that if convicted of any offense punishable under any law, which means that it does away with the requirement of the 1 year crime punishment provision, which means that any crime that is committed and a person accused of that he is liable to give his features or give his measurements to that effect. And this is the first feature. And then what are the measurements that can be taken? So obviously in the 1920 law there were less measurements which could be taken. So finger impressions, foot impressions, measurements such as height, photographs, these were the limited features in the 1920 law. In the amended act there are finger impressions, palm print impressions, footprint impressions, photographs, iris and retina scan, the scanning of the eyes, physical, biological samples and their analysis, behavioral attributes including signatures, handwriting or any other examination referred to in section 53 or 53A of the Criminal Procedure Code. So as we can see, this is the exact ambit of the collection of the features and measurements that has been increased in the Criminal Procedure Amendment Act. This is the parent provision which has been updated. Then the destruction of measurements provision is also, there's a difference, which meant that in case of acquittal, discharge or release, if not previously convicted of any other offense punishable with rigorous imprisonment or 1 year or upwards, which meant that if any person's features were taken or were recorded in for his or her arrest, if that person comes out to be not guilty or he is not a previous convict person, so in that case the features recorded or the measurements taken in the database should be destructed. But this provision is done away with in the present act, where in case of acquittal, discharge or release, if not previously convicted of any offense punishable with rigorous imprisonment for any term, for convicts, records are to be destroyed from 75 years of collection, which means that those persons who are convicted, their records will stand for 75 years. They will be stored for 75 years in the database of the law enforcement database. So these are the parent features of the Criminal Procedure Amendment Act and how they are different from the Identification of Prisoners Act. So as we can see, the new act obviously contains more features and it can be said to be a little more rigorous. So let's try to look at what are some of the concerns that have been raised with respect to these laws. So first concern is that it is a colonial legislation legacy, which means that the Britishers had brought out this law in the year 1920, and now that particular same law is being carried forward in the form of amending the new act. So it shows that the kind of mindset it was in the colonial British rulers who wanted to keep a tab or keep a check on the Indian citizens, it somewhere highlights that particular mindset. That is why it can be called to be a colonial legislation legacy. Second is that it clashes with the right to privacy. This becomes its most major concern, wherein you want to take up the features and measurement of those person who are accused of crimes. That is a good part, but taking and recording their features can be an infringement on their right to privacy as well, which we know was identified by the Supreme Court as a fundamental right in the K.S. Puttasamy judgment. And what did it say with respect to gauging whether a law is pertinent or compliant to the right to privacy or not? So it gave 3 conditions, stating that if these 3 conditions are properly satisfied, then the court will be able to, or the authority should be able to come to a conclusion that this law does not violate the right to privacy. And what are those 3 conditions? It said that there is a need for the measure to be taken. So first condition is about the need. Second is the pursuance of a legitimate aim of the state, right? Then to be backed by the law. Second is be backed by the law, and third is be necessary and proportionate to the aim being sought to be achieved. So the 3 conditions are that there should be a need for this law, which in pursuance of a legitimate aim, then it should be backed by a law, which means that any any such object that is to be legislated upon. One cannot just put out a simple order or an executive order to be that. It should be backed by a law or act promulgated in the parliament, right? And third is that it should be necessary and proportionate. This becomes the most important provision wherein you have to look at that kind of act which will be infringing the privacy in order to satisfy this need and legitimate aim of the state. It should be proportionate in a proportionate manner. So the criticizers are, as stated in the article, are disagreeing on the third point, where it says that there is a need for the measure to be taken because protecting the citizens from the criminals in the society is a legitimate aim of the state. Then it is being backed by the law, the act is being brought. It is the third part where the criticizers are feeling that it is not proportionate enough and there needs to be more safeguards for the right to privacy. So this becomes a major concern. And third is as to how this move can be found to be disproportionate is that these measurements can be used for other purposes as well, something known as predictive policing, which means that those people who are accused or those people who are in the history sheets of the law enforcement agencies, they can be called back again and again just because their measurements are recorded in the database. So that is something which can happen with people, and that is one of the concerns with respect to the proportionality of the provisions of the law is being raised. Then as we saw, one concern is about the 1 year versus any offense, where in the previous law at least there was a provision that those crimes which have punishments above 1 year, they would be liable for recording of the features, but here any offense should be liable for the person to give their measurements and features. Then one cannot rule out the possibility of mass surveillance due to this act, wherein if the features and measurements and to such great extent are to be recorded by the law enforcement agencies, they can be very well misused by other agencies as well, and therefore the possibility of mass surveillance or putting or keeping an eye on public at large, this increases the possibility of such an act. So therefore, it is important to critically analyze the provisions of the act, keep the provisions which are useful intact, and those which are disproportionate and harm the right to privacy and the other safety needs of the individuals, they need to be taken care of. So with this, let's move on to our next article for the day. The next article now which comes in the newspaper reads, Youth Employment Declined in India, says ILO report. Now this is an important article because this gives us data which we can use in our answer writing with respect to these topics. So this becomes important for us from the point of view of GS3, wherein we study the aspects of Indian economy. So what is the article talking about? So ILO, or the International Labour Organization, is the premier organization at the world level which deals with the aspects of labor related issues and activities. So it is the international organization which deals with setting of the standards of the labor that should be there in countries, takes out such reports as the article is saying, gauging the conditions of the various countries' economy. So in this aspect, it has taken out the Global Employment Trends for Youth 2020 report. This is the report that has been taken out by the ILO, released by the International Labour Organization. What is it saying? It is saying that India experienced severe working hour employment losses in 2020 and 2021, and Indian youth employment deteriorated in 2021 compared with the 2020 situation. So what this means that because of the pandemic, people lost their jobs and therefore the working hours were decreased, and the unemployment, especially youth unemployment, which means that those people who are in their youth age found more difficulties in seeking jobs. That is what the report is highlighting. Other thing which it says that the report said surveys conducted by the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, or the CMIE. This is a premier data collection organization in India in the Indian economy aspect. It shows that the youth employment participation rate declined by 0.9 percentage points over the first 9 months of 2021 relative to its value in 2020, while it increased by 2 percentage points for the adults over the same time period. So this shows that at least there was a small increase in adult employment rate, but there was a decrease in the youth unemployment rate. So youth employment rate, this is what the CMI data pointed out, which again corroborates the data that the number of jobs which the youth of the country are getting, it is decreasing. They are facing more employment. And why is this happening? Obviously, the pandemic created more inequalities. So the report added that school closures, which lasted 18 months of the pandemic, 2 years, among the 24 crore school going children, only 8% of such children in rural areas and 23% in urban areas had adequate access to online education. So the percentage of students who could access online education also drastically decreased. We can see the number. In rural areas, only 8% children had access to online education, and in urban areas where we feel that most number of students would be having tablets and mobile phones, of them also only 23% of the students had access to online education. So this is a big factor as to why in the coming years as well it would be a problem, because it not only prevented new learning, where if for the 18 months when students are not able to go to school, they are also not able to learn anything, but there is also decrease of the learning capacity. So it also led to phenomenon of what is called learning regression, which means that whatever the students learned in the previous months, now not having continuous exposure to them, they keep losing those abilities. So this is known as learning regression, that is children forgetting what they had learned earlier. And in India, it was found that 92% of children on average lost at least one foundational ability in language, and 82% lost at least one foundational ability in mathematics. This is something which we students face in UPSC preparation as well, where if we are studying for 4-5 days and suddenly there comes a gap of 4-5 days, we are suddenly not able to remember what we studied. This is known as learning regression, and that is why the aspects of consistency and continuously studying and revising what we study is therefore advocated. So this is the same concept which was seen in the school going students as well, due to their stoppage in learning due to the pandemic and the school closures caused due to pandemic. So this is the snapshot of what the report says, and we can use this data whenever we want to incorporate these points in any of the answers that we write. So with this, let's move on to our next article for the day. The next article which features in the newspaper reads, dozens in China infected with the Langya virus found in shrews. Now, as if there is any shortage of viruses in the society right now or in the world right now, there are new viruses upcoming, and it is from again the place of wherein the COVID-19 virus came in, that is China. And there's a new virus now known as the Langya virus, which has infected around 35 people in China, and it is said to be increasing. And it is said that it is found in these small mouse-like animals, or which are actually mammals, known as shrews. So let's try to learn about what this Langya virus is, what are its symptoms, what do we need to know about it, and how much fear do we need to have about it as to what it can do. So it's a zoonotic virus. What is a zoonotic virus? Any virus or any pathogen that transfers or is residing in an animal is known as a zoonotic disease. And since this is a virus, it would be a zoonotic virus named Langya Henapi virus, or the LAV. LAV has been discovered in China with 35 infections identified so far. And this Langya virus is a part of genus of viruses called Henipa viruses, right? So the parent body of the viruses is known as, the genus of these viruses is known as Henipa viruses. When the COVID-19 virus came in, we saw that they belong to the genus of coronaviruses, wherein these viruses had corona-like projections, right? Such kind of projections was there. This is what is the figure of coronavirus that we saw. So that was the genus of coronavirus, and these genus of virus are known as Henipa viruses, from which the Langya virus is coming. And these Henipa viruses belong to the family of paramyxoviruses. They can cause severe illness in animals and humans and are classified as biosafety level 4 or pathogens with case fertility rates between 40 to 75. So they have considerable fatality rates, and the general viruses that we see of the diseases pre-existing, a lot of them belong to this genus of henipaviruses. What are those? The types of henipaviruses that had been identified till now include Hendra, Nipah virus, which we keep hearing about, the Cedar virus, Mujiang, and the Ghanaian bat virus. So of this, only certain are fatal. So the Cedar virus, Ghanaian bat virus, and Mujiang virus are not known to cause human disease, but the Hendra and the Nipah virus infect humans and can cause fatal illness. We have seen the outbreak of Nipah virus in Africa, where it caused a lot of damage, and as of now there are no licensed drugs or vaccines meant for humans with respect to the Langya virus or the Henipa virus genus which it broadly belongs to. Then what about the shrews, which the article is saying that this Langya virus is said to generally reside in shrews. So what are shrews? They are small mouse-like mammals and they live in subleaf stratum in the forest, and they are generally insectivorous. Insect is the primary diet of these animals. So it is not confirmed, but it is believed that these viruses exist in the shrews, but is it transferred from them to humans? That is not yet concluded. And then we look at where was it discovered first. So Langya was discovered in eastern China during surveillance testing of patients who had fever along with the recent history of animal exposure. And where has Langya virus come from? In all likelihood, the new virus has jumped from an animal to humans, and the Levi virus or the RNA has been predominantly found in shrews, which may be its natural hosts. And it is not known yet whether this virus is capable of human-to-human transaction, which was the case with COVID. Human-to-human transmission was possible. In this virus, whether human-to-human transmission is possible or not, that is not completely known. But it has come from an animal to the humans, that has been discovered. And what are the symptoms of the Langya virus? Fever, fatigue, cough, muscle aches and pains, nausea, headache and vomiting were the common symptoms. These are the common symptoms related to the Langya virus, and more than half of the patients also had leukopenia, defined as an insufficient number of pathogen fighting white blood cells, which means that less immunity, less number of white blood cells present in the body, condition known as leukopenia, and more than a third had thrombocytopenia, that is a low number of blood clotting cells called platelets. So all of these chemicals and compounds are very necessary to build up the immunity of the body, and those patients which had less of it were more prone to these diseases, and an impaired liver or kidney function was also detected in a few patients. So this was the backdrop with respect to this recent virus. Let's see whether this transmits out of China and causes the same damage as other types of viruses as well. So we stop here. We finish today's discussion with respect to the important articles, and we'll meet again next time with the important articles from the newspaper. Thank you.